the politics of hate is the business model of cable television. It's the business model of digital platforms, and it's incredibly profitable. It just happens to be incredibly destructive for the capacity of a democracy to do anything. And yet that is the reality that we see in the way media operates. It's the reality around fundraising. I mean, the fact is, if you've got to raise money the old-fashioned way, the most reliable technique you've got is the politics of hate, to sort of gin up hatred to the other side, make it seem like they're the devil. If they have any power at all, it'll be the end of the republic. And that drives the passion to get money into your side. And if we don't find a way to build democracy on top of a platform that doesn't depend on making us stupid and hate each other, we're not going to build a democracy. And I agree. It's really important to recognize it's not just campaign finance reform, finance. I mean, that's a symptom of a deeper problem. But the cable and the digital problem is really profound. And given the First Amendment, there's relatively little the government can do about it. But we need to think creatively about how we're going to address that problem, too.
I have an idea that I'm trying to develop around it. Because to me, so you have, and so let's put people here and then media, corporate interests sort of as a layer between people and legislators, and then we'll put legislators on top, and then legislators have their own messed up incentives. So to me, the media layer is vital, because right now we're turning on each other. We're more polarized than ever. A lot of people are losing faith that we can get anything done together, which is being borne out by the facts. You have Congress walking away from a Recovery Act, even though it's obvious to all of us that we need to extend benefits. And so the polarization is going to destroy us. And the media, unfortunately, benefits from that polarization. So what do you do? So here's my suggestion. You're right that we have First Amendment protections, and no one necessarily wants folks to be governing what can and can't be said in various news outlets. On the other side, you have over 1,000 local newspapers that have gone out of business because they can't survive. Craigslist and internet ads have disrupted their advertising models. And so to me, if you want a functioning democracy, you need to have local papers. And there have been studies that showed that if you don't have any local news source in your town, then you just vote on very polarized lines and nothing ever gets done. Is bad for democracy. And when I was going around the country in Iowa, New Hampshire, and Ohio, and everywhere else, they were very passionate about this because they lost their paper. And you kind of lose your identity if you don't have a local paper. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So step one is to say, look, local journalism, or journalism generally, is a public good in a functioning democracy. And we need a way to pay for it that is not advertising or subscription.
Yes. And so why don't you take an Andrew Yang-like idea? You could imagine giving people journalism dollars that they could use to fund their local papers. I completely agree with you. And, one thing we forget is that at the birth of this nation, the biggest expenditures the government made were expenditures designed to knit together an infrastructure of information. The post office was the forefront of that. I mean, now we're trying to starve the post office to defeat the election. But at that time, the post office was the biggest employer. And the biggest debate was whether they should make newspapers free to distribute or charge them a tiny little amount to filter out, just junk. But their commitment to subsidize the production of news and information and the spread of information was absolute. And they realized you couldn't have a nation if you didn't have an infrastructure of informed citizens. I mean, Jefferson's idea here is really powerful and supportive. And what we've done is we've evolved into a nation where, we've handed over the production of information to these platforms whose incentives have nothing to do with informing us in a balanced and meaningful way. Their incentives are to sell ads.
The opposite, unfortunately.
Yeah. And until we change those incentives, until that business model is changed, I don't know what we do. Now, there are alternatives. I mean, this right here, like a podcast. I like to think about the, the slow food movement, which basically says, like, if you just cook your food.
There's like the slow media movement.
Yeah, it's the slow democracy movement, the slow democracy movement. Like, if we do democracy in certain places, we can do it well. And if we do it in other places, we do it poorly. So if you do democracy on Twitter or Facebook, it's no good. because you're reacting to the kind of politics of hate and you're being driven by ad incentives and all of that is bad. But if you do politics in like podcasts or long form narrative or town hall environments, then that's more fixed to us as humans. Like we have a chance to reflect and to think and to hear both sides and to get deep on an issue. And so the question isn't so much whether we blow up Twitter or Facebook. The question is, how can we channel more of our political attention into places where the attention span is greater than 5 seconds? I mean, you must have hit this all the time. You know, UBI is an obvious point once you understand it. But to understand it, it takes 5 minutes at least, or maybe 10 minutes
an hour
to explain it. Yeah. And how many, I'm a professor, so I have the opportunity to force people to listen to me, to lecture for an hour. But if you're out there on the campaign trail and you've got like 30 seconds to make your pitch, how are you going to explain an idea like UBI in a way that people can understand? But if you could bring them into a place like this, a podcast where they listen for an hour to a conversation, then ordinary people, anybody can come around to understanding it. So the point is not that you need smart people. You need smart environments. It's not that you need like PhDs running government. You just need people placed in a context where they have an opportunity to actually understand before you ask them what they want to do. And we could build that environment. We just have no incentive to build it right now.
I'm a big believer in common sense and the judgment of ordinary Americans. You go to them and you say, hey, if you had a choice between bailing out Wall Street or homeowners, which would you choose? Like virtually every normal person would have been like, let's keep people in their homes. And, I think that's a superior judgment than the one we actually adopted in 08 and 09.
Again and again and again, yeah.
So I agree with you that you don't need degrees or erudition necessarily. You just need good information and an environment that's actually rewarded for providing you information in a way, or judgment or discussion or argument, like in a way that's balanced and reasonable and meant to provide you the tools to participate in your own democracy. So here's the opportunity, maybe. Here's what I figured out. And this is the big plan I'm going to try and propose, is that, so all of these local papers have gone out of existence. We believe that we need to bring them back, I believe, or support the ones that are hanging on. And so what you said about journalism dollars is right, is where I'm going. But the way that we consume information now is so varied that my thought would be that it would essentially be a micropayment model tied to our attention. So let's imagine that every U.S. citizen had $50 a month that goes to the stuff that they pay attention to. And so then you can't make it complicated for people. So it's essentially just tied to whatever article I look at, or if I subscribe to something, I can use some of it on that. And then we could end up creating like a positive set of supports for some of the journalism that we want, without having to go down this road of like, you can't say this, you can't say that. In other words, you reward the positive without trying to circumscribe communications in other sectors. And you make it so that like the unreasonable media is more clearly such. So we say, like, if you've got like the carnival barker on the side, yelling about things, then you can be like, look, you can yell, like, it's your right. It's just you're not going to participate in this journalism dollars set of incentives and rewards.
Well, so is journalism dollars directed to just the bottom line, or is it directed to certain kind of activities that we know we can't do anymore? I mean, like the most important activity journalism used to do was investigative journalism. I mean, the only way to keep local governments honest was for a reporter to show up at city hall meetings, or to, go to city hall and talk to people. And now there are no reporters anymore. So the corruption at the local level is exploding. So is journalism dollars driven towards like supporting particular kinds of journalism, or it's just we're going to give you money based on the number of eyeballs that you happen to attract?
So the initial thought, and part of the reason why I liked I like being paid based on your attention, is I'm also concerned that we have a creative atmosphere that is increasingly impossible for musicians, artists, of all kinds, as well as journalists. But I agree with you that there's some fundamental public purpose to journalism. One of the things I suggested on the campaign trail was that we publicly fund a number of investigative journalists per congressional district, with the thinking being like, you know what, if you have a congressional district, I'm sure there's important stuff going on there. And so you have these journalism fellows that you can.
It's a great idea.
And we had it as like the same number as like congressmen you get. It's federally funded. They're there. Like you would probably knight someone from within the community. It'd be like this big honor. We essentially have to make journalism this publicly valued profession. And I got into this giant, not giant, it was like a minor Twitter spat on this issue where I was like, look, journalism's dying and we need a new model to fix it. And then some journalists took issue with me and said, journalism's adapting and we're comparing this to a new thing. And then I just went on this mini diatribe. I was like, look, 1,000+ local papers out of existence. I've been to those towns. People are devastated by their loss. Every journalist knows hundreds or thousands of colleagues who've lost their jobs over this last period of time. If a young person comes to you and asks about going into the field, you try and scare them off. You're like, this is not the field you want to go into. You have major media outlets like Time Magazine, or not Time, Time, being bought by media moguls. Oh no, sorry, tech moguls as like a trophy property. Washington Post, bought by Bezos. And so we have this market distortion of journalism that is going to make, in my opinion, a functional democracy impossible to resuscitate or rejuvenate.
Well, I think it's a really important idea for creativity in general. I don't know if you know of my colleague Terry Fisher, who wrote this really wonderful book called Promises to Keep about copyright. And his idea for copyright was, copyright used to be obsessed with controlling copies. In the digital age, that makes no sense. Instead, what we ought to do is just make it totally trivially easy for people to copy things all over the place. But then artists get paid based on the frequency with which their content gets consumed. So, if you happen to be an incredibly popular artist, like we're tracking who's consuming what, and you get paid based on the fact that people want to listen to you 10 times more than Lyle Lovett. I never understand that, but that just seems to be the reality of music. So that's a way of like encouraging people to create and encouraging the sharing of creativity, but also guaranteeing that artists get paid. And I think that would work for a good chunk of the journalism part. But I do think that the other idea you were talking about is really critical. You need journalists who in some sense are not thinking about the bottom line.
Yes,
the great 100%. Thing the New York Times can do is it can say to a investigative journalist, like, take a year. Just think about this for a year. And at the end of it, if we've got something, we got something. If we don't, we don't. But your job is not going to hang on whether you get a Pulitzer Prize winning article at the end. And so I think these fellowships is a really great idea. Like ProPublica supports the idea of basically creating effectively fellowships in journalism. We could multiply that. I love the congressional district because you want to really drive it into the local jurisdictions and say like there are 10 journalist ProPublica fellows in every district. And then let these people, be judged locally about whether they're doing good work, but at least you'd begin to drive attention to an area which right now there's no return for. Like, why would you ever talk about it?
Yeah, so there are so many things we need to do in the media sector in particular. It's funny, and you were ahead of me on this as well. Your last book talked about a lot of these issues. I kind of lived it. I lived my version of it. Yeah. But I'm convinced changing the incentives for media has to be part of the puzzle or part of the process, because at this point, people are getting their information in very limited ways. And when you talk about podcasts too, this is like a thing that I'm very sensitive to. It's like podcasts work for folks like you and I that have a following, but it's not like a real replacement. Like, do I love podcasts? Yes, I do. Obviously, we're on it. And that was one of the things that some folks in the media came back to me about, where they said, like, look, like we have these podcasts. And I said, well, you have that podcast because you're a big deal journalist and you actually can get audience. But it's not like the format does not replace other forms of journalism. It certainly doesn't replace the investigative journalism you're talking about.
Yeah, I don't think it replaces it. All I'm trying to think about is, like, how do we get people? Yeah, how do we get people into the right context for the kind of question we want them to think about. I mean, this is, I think what's interesting here is I just think this is a sort of problem we never had to worry about before. Like, serious problems were in contexts where you had serious attention to think about it. You had time to think about it. And now we got to make sure that's possible. Instead of like imagining people are going to make a judgment about who the Democratic nominee is going to be based on their Twitter feed or their Facebook news feed. Like, how do we get them into a place where they have a better opportunity to think about the range of people? So, you experienced New Hampshire, an extraordinary context where people meet people face to face over the course of 2 years. By the end of that 2-year period, everybody knew who Andrew Yang was. Everybody knew your character. They didn't know you through your ads on, I don't know if you had television ads, but they didn't know you through ads.
We spent approximately, I think it was something like 4 or 5 million on TV ads in New Hampshire alone.
That's great. But that's not how they...
New Hampshire.
But not just because of that. The point is, they could see you face to face and know your character. I mean, I remember that town hall where, you appealed to our children and like, what are we leaving our children? And your eyes welled up and I looked out in the audience and people were weeping. That was because New Hampshire puts politics at a personal retail level. And so people have a deep understanding of the character because of the place that they begin to meet them. And we got to think that way about these problems generally. Like, it's okay to think about what brand of toothpaste you need to be consuming at the kind of Twitter level attention span. Like, you don't need to worry about that so much. But who the next president should be, or like whether UBI should be at the center of any economic plan, that takes real thought, not smart thought. It just takes, as you were saying, common sense thought. But common sense driven by people who have an opportunity to understand both sides and to reflect on it in a way that gives them confidence.
Thank you for listening in. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you did, please do subscribe to Yang Speaks and click on notifications so we can let you know every time we have a new episode.